Jan, the boy by the window. 14-year-old Elijah Brooks sat quietly at the far end of room 2B, right next to the window that overlooked the schoolyard. It was a breezy fall morning in Richmond, Virginia, and the hum of early conversation filled Jefferson Middle School as students filed in, dragging backpacks and settling into their seats. Elijah, however, barely made a sound. He moved with an ease that made him almost invisible, like he'd mastered the art of slipping under the radar. Most days, he kept to himself. He didn't raise his hand, he rarely joined group discussions, and unless someone called his name directly, you'd be forgiven for forgetting he was even there. His teachers had grown used to his quiet ways, often mistaking them for lack of interest. The truth was, Elijah just preferred to observe. He saw things most people missed, like the subtle shift in the wind outside the classroom, or the way the leaves danced in little spirals along the edge of the sidewalk. His eyes, deep brown and thoughtful, often drifted out that window during lessons. While others scribbled notes or tried to sneak glances at their phones, Elijah watched the world beyond the glass, birds skipping along the fence, clouds morphing into shapes only he seemed to notice. To most of his classmates, Elijah looked like a daydreamer, someone who had mentally checked out long ago. And, in a way, they weren't entirely wrong. What they didn't know, what nobody really knew, was that behind those faraway eyes, Elijah's mind was running at full speed. Numbers, patterns, and equations came to him like music comes to a composer. He didn't need a textbook to stay engaged. His curiosity ran deeper than the worksheets and lesson plans. He wasn't zoning out. He was zooming ahead. At the bottom of his math notebook, where most students had doodles or blank margins, Elijah kept a collection of equations that he'd thought up on his own, puzzles he built from scratch and challenged himself to solve during free time. He never showed them to anyone, not his friends, not his teachers. It wasn't that he was shy exactly, he just didn't see the point. To him, math was personal. It was like a secret language, a quiet space where he could think clearly, away from the noise of the world. His silence in class wasn't about fear or rebellion. It was about peace. Elijah liked sitting near the window, not because he didn't care, but because it gave him room to breathe. No one expected much from the kid who stared out at the trees, and he was fine with that. It kept the pressure off. It kept the questions away. But what Elijah didn't realize, what he couldn't have predicted, was that the very thing he tried to keep hidden would soon be the thing that made everyone finally see him. Elijah's math notebook was worn at the corners, the spine soft from being bent open so many times. On the surface, it looked like every other school-issued composition book, lines, assignments, the occasional teacher comment in red ink. But between those pages, especially in the margins, lived an entirely different world. While the front of the book held worksheets on linear equations and percentage word problems, the edges told another story. Elijah had filled them with strings of variables, graphs, and self-made puzzles, equations that spiraled far beyond the curriculum. He wasn't just solving problems, he was inventing them. Sometimes he'd jot down patterns he noticed on his walk to school, like the sequence of license plates or the spacing of cracks in the sidewalk. Other times, it was things that popped into his head during class. What would happen if you took the Fibonacci sequence and folded it into a matrix? Could you create a pattern out of prime numbers that built a visual shape? No one had ever asked him those kinds of questions. So, he asked himself. What made it even more surprising was that Elijah had no formal training. He wasn't in any special gifted program. His parents worked hard, his mom in a hospital cafeteria, his dad at an auto shop. And while they supported him fully, they didn't exactly sit around talking about abstract math theory at dinner. Everything Elijah had figured out, he'd done on his own, driven by a hunger that never quite went away. To the outside world, he looked like he wasn't paying attention. He rarely spoke up in class, and if someone called on him, he usually responded in a voice barely above a whisper. But that didn't mean he didn't know the answer. Most of the time, he already knew it. He just didn't feel the need to say it out loud. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He just loved it. The way numbers fit together, how a messy equation could suddenly snap into place like the final piece of a puzzle. It gave him a sense of control in a world that often felt chaotic. And so, Elijah kept his brilliance to himself. It was a Tuesday, the kind of ordinary day where everything feels like it's on autopilot, the same hallway chatter, the same announcements over the intercom, the same buzz of fluorescent lights in room 2B. Elijah Brooks sat in his usual seat near the window, eyes gently trailing the sway of branches outside. A bird pecked at the grass. 2 squirrels darted along the fence line. In the background, Mrs. Lawrence's voice bounced off the whiteboard as she walked the class through a set of review problems. "Elijah," she said, glancing his way, "can you tell us what the coefficient is in number 4? He didn't answer. His hand supported his chin, elbow propped loosely on the desk. From a distance, it looked like he was dozing off. "Elijah," she repeated, sharper this time. His head snapped up. "Huh? Sorry," he muttered. A few students giggled. One boy whispered, "Window watchers at it again." Another snorted. Mrs. Lawrence pressed her lips into a line. She was usually patient, but something about the day, maybe the 3rd failed pop quiz she'd graded that morning, had her fuse a little shorter. She stepped toward the board. "Since you seem distracted, let's see how well you're actually paying attention." Her marker screeched across the surface as she wrote an equation. A big one. Something with exponents, fractions, variables on both sides. It wasn't meant to humiliate, but it definitely wasn't part of the 8th grade curriculum either. A few students leaned forward, eyebrows raised. "Dang, what even is that?" someone whispered. "She's setting him up," another said under their breath. "He's toast." Mrs. Lawrence capped the marker and turned to Elijah. "Come up and solve this." His chest tightened. The silence in the room was suffocating. He could feel eyes on him, amused, curious, doubtful. He stood slowly, chair scraping against the linoleum. His hands felt too big, too awkward. As he walked to the front, every step felt like a spotlight pressing down on him. The marker felt cold in his palm. He stared at the problem. For a second, everything went blurry, and then, almost instinctively, his mind clicked into gear. It was like muscle memory, the same quiet focus he had at his desk when no one was watching. Only now they were watching. He took a breath, then another, and he began. At first the marker squeaked hesitantly as he wrote. He cleared a fraction, moved a term. A voice in the back whispered, "Wait, is he actually doing it?" Bit by bit, the equation unraveled under his hand. He didn't rush. He just kept moving, step by step. Soon, the snickers stopped. The class leaned in. Even the students who usually tuned out were staring, eyes bouncing between Elijah and the growing work on the board. Mrs. Lawrence watched with arms folded, her expression unreadable. Elijah reached the end, circled his answer, capped the marker. Silence. The classroom, just seconds earlier filled with anticipation, felt frozen in time. Then, click, click, Mrs. Lawrence's heels tapped as she stepped forward to check his work. Her finger traced the solution line by line. Her eyes flicked back and forth. When she finally looked at him, there was no sarcasm, no irritation, just quiet amazement. "This is correct," she said, her voice softer than usual. Gasps rippled across the room. "Wait, he actually solved it? No way." He didn't even hesitate. Then came the claps, scattered at first, unsure, then stronger, louder. Elijah stood frozen, his cheeks burned, but not from embarrassment. From something else entirely, something he didn't feel very often. Pride. For the first time, the kid by the window wasn't invisible, and for the first time, he didn't want to be. The applause eventually faded, but the feeling stayed. Elijah turned away from the board, his heart still thudding in his chest, and walked slowly back to his seat. A few classmates patted his shoulder as he passed. One girl gave him a thumbs up. Another just stared at him, like she was seeing him for the first time. By the time he sat down, the window he loved so much no longer held his attention. His focus had shifted, because now, for the first time, everyone else's had too. Mrs. Lawrence stood at the front, hands clasped together, gaze sweeping the class. "What you just saw wasn't luck," she said, her voice clear and calm. "That was understanding. That was hard work, patience, and clarity of thought." She turned to Elijah. "I want all of you to remember something. Brilliance doesn't always raise its hand. Sometimes it just watches, listens, and waits. Elijah felt something catch in his throat. Not embarrassment, but something more powerful. Relief. Validation. For so long, he'd stayed in the background. Today he'd stepped into the light, and it hadn't burned. It had felt right. After class, as students filed out in a low buzz of whispers and excitement, Mrs. Lawrence called out gently, "Elijah, can you stay a moment?" He froze, notebook clutched in hand. A dozen thoughts raced through his mind. Was I in trouble? Did I go too far? When the room emptied, she walked toward him and leaned slightly against her desk, arms crossed. Not in the strict way she usually stood, but more relaxed, thoughtful. "I owe you something," she said. Elijah tilted his head. "What do you mean?" "A bit of an apology," she said. "I've been teaching a long time. I thought I knew how to read my students. But with you," she paused, letting the silence breathe. "I got it wrong. I mistook quiet for disinterest, stillness for detachment. But clearly, you've been more engaged than I ever realized." Elijah shifted uncomfortably, not sure what to say. "It's okay," he mumbled. "No," she replied softly. "It's not. You have a gift, Elijah. What you did today, most students wouldn't even attempt. You not only tried, you nailed it. That tells me a lot about the way your mind works." He looked down at his notebook, fingers tracing the edge of its worn cover. "I just like doing it," he said. "Math, I mean. It makes sense to me, even when everything else doesn't." Mrs. Lawrence nodded slowly. "That's exactly why it matters, but you shouldn't keep it hidden anymore. There are advanced programs in the district, math clubs, competitions. I'd like to help you find one, if you're open to it." Elijah's stomach fluttered. He'd never imagined going beyond the classroom, beyond his notebook. But now the idea didn't seem impossible. It felt possible. "Okay," he said after a long pause. "Yeah, I think I'd like that." Mrs. Lawrence smiled, not just as a teacher, but as someone who had finally seen something others had missed. "This is only the beginning," she said, "and I think you're just getting started." As Elijah walked home that afternoon, the fall air felt crisper, the wind cooler on his face. His mind wasn't spinning with worry or doubt anymore. It was dreaming, wondering how far his love for numbers could take him now that the world was finally watching. And when he sat down at his kitchen table later that night, opening his notebook under the soft kitchen light, he didn't turn to the margins. He turned to a fresh. The next morning, when Elijah walked into room 2B, everything felt just a little different. His desk was still by the window, the trees outside still danced in the breeze, and Mrs. Lawrence still stood at the whiteboard with her usual stack of handouts. But the way the class looked at him, that had changed. "Yo, Elijah," a kid from the back of the room called out, grinning. "You made that problem yesterday look like a joke." "Seriously," someone else chimed in. "You, destroyed it." Elijah gave a small, awkward smile, unsure how to respond. Compliments still felt foreign, but this time he didn't shrink into his seat. He nodded politely, then opened his notebook like usual, except now he felt like people actually noticed. Even Mrs. Lawrence gave him a small, knowing smile before starting the lesson. She didn't call on him right away, but when she did, her tone was warm, encouraging. "Elijah," she said midway through the review, "you want to take this one?" He hesitated for only a second. "Yeah," he said, voice clearer than usual. He answered the question in a calm, steady rhythm, not showing off, just explaining. And when he finished, there were no giggles, no whispers, just silence, followed by quiet nods. After the bell rang, as the other students grabbed their backpacks and filed out, Mrs. Lawrence approached him. "Elijah," she said, "can we talk for a minute?" He stayed behind as the room emptied. She walked over and handed him a pamphlet, thick paper, bright colors, a title at the top in bold letters. District Enrichment Program, Advanced Mathematics for Middle Schoolers. "I spoke to the program director last night," she said. "Told her about you. She's already reviewed some of your notebook pages I scanned, and she's interested, very interested." Elijah's eyes widened as he held the pamphlet. The words felt heavy in his hands. Enrichment, advanced, challenge. "They meet twice a week after school," Mrs. Lawrence continued. "You'd be with other students who share your passion. It's not just about being smart, it's about being surrounded by people who think like you, who see the world in numbers too. Elijah didn't answer right away. His fingers ran over the edge of the paper. His brain raced with questions. What if I mess up? What if I'm not ready? What if they expect too much? But then he remembered the board, the equation, the room going quiet, and his answer came from somewhere deeper than doubt. I want to try, he said softly, then louder. Yes, I'll do it. Mrs. Lawrence's face lit up. Good. I'll help you get registered. You've got something special, Elijah, and it's time the rest of the world saw it too. That night at home, Elijah sat at the dinner table with his parents, the pamphlet spread open between them. His mom read every word out loud. His dad nodded with pride, repeating, "That's my boy," under his breath. His mom's eyes shone as she looked at him. "We always knew you had something big inside you," she said. "Now you've got somewhere to take it." Later, in his room, Elijah opened his notebook and flipped past the crowded pages, past the margins filled with dreams no one had ever read. He found a fresh page. This time, he didn't write an equation. He wrote a goal: join the program, challenge myself, don't hide anymore. He stared at those words, then underlined the last one twice. Because the boy by the window wasn't just watching anymore. He was ready to step through it and see how far he could go. By the time Friday rolled around, Room 2B felt like a different world. Elijah Brooks wasn't just the quiet kid by the window anymore. He had become something more, not loud, not flashy, but noticed, respected. Students who used to walk right past him now nodded in the hallway. Some even asked for help with homework, or if he could explain how he figured that crazy problem out earlier in the week. A few just sat beside him during lunch, curious, not just about math, but about him. And Elijah? He didn't quite know how to handle the attention. He still liked the quiet, still liked the breeze on his face and the sound of leaves tapping the classroom windows. But now, for the first time, he was learning that being seen didn't mean losing himself. It just meant he had more room to grow. Mrs. Lawrence noticed it too. She started shifting the way she ran the class, asking more open-ended questions, slowing down when a student seemed hesitant, calling on the quiet ones with patience instead of pressure. She'd learned something from Elijah. Just because a student doesn't speak up doesn't mean they're not thinking. One afternoon, after class, she caught Elijah on his way out. "I just want you to know," she said, "you've helped me as much as I've helped you." He looked confused. She smiled. "You reminded me to look closer, to ask more, assume less, to believe that sometimes brilliance is just waiting for a little room to breathe." Elijah didn't say much in response. He just nodded, but his eyes said everything. Later that week, he walked into the first session of the district's advanced math program. The room was buzzing with energy. Students from all over the city gathered at long tables, notebooks open, pencils flying. It was different than Room 2B, faster, sharper. But it didn't scare him. He sat down, listened, and when it was his turn to speak, he did. Not with the loudest voice in the room, but with confidence. And as the problems grew harder, Elijah's focus grew stronger. He started asking his own questions, suggesting new approaches. It wasn't long before he realized he belonged here, not just because he could keep up, but because he had something to contribute. Back at Jefferson Middle, things continued to shift. The girl who used to doodle in the back started raising her hand more. A boy who never turned in homework stayed after class to ask for help. The room felt more alive, less like a space for grades and more like a space for growth. And at the center of that quiet change was a kid who had once been content to stay invisible. Now he was proof of something bigger. That brilliance doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just waits, patiently, by the window, until the right moment to shine. That weekend, Elijah sat at the kitchen table long after the dinner plates had been cleared. His old math notebook lay open beside a brand new one, crisp, unmarked, waiting. The house was quiet, the only sound coming from the ticking clock above the fridge and the faint hum of a dryer tumbling in the laundry room. He flipped through the worn pages of his first notebook, fingers brushing across the messy margins, the cramped calculations, the wild theories no one had seen for months. Every line told a story of curiosity, escape, and quiet triumph. His eyes paused on the page where he'd solved the board problem from memory the night after everything had changed. He'd circled the answer and written one word in the corner, finally. Now, he picked up his pencil and opened the fresh notebook. But instead of jumping into equations, he wrote something else at the top of the first page. What comes next? Because Elijah knew this wasn't the end of the story. This was just the start of a longer road, one with tougher problems, new faces, and moments where he might feel uncertain again. But this time, he wasn't afraid of that. He was learning that being brilliant didn't mean always knowing the answer. It meant showing up, trying, owning what made you different, and using it. And more than that, he realized that somewhere along the way, his quiet passion had sparked something bigger. In his classmates, in his teacher, even in himself. That night, his mom peeked into the kitchen and found him still writing, deep in thought. "You're still at it?" she asked with a soft smile. Elijah nodded. "Yeah, I want to keep going." She walked over and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "We're proud of you, baby. Always have been. But seeing you proud of yourself, that's the best part." Elijah looked up at her, smiled, then turned back to the page. He didn't know exactly where this road would lead. College, competitions, maybe even a future where he helped other kids like him. Quiet, brilliant, and waiting to be seen. But right now, all he needed was this moment. One pencil, one fresh page, one more problem to solve. And with that, the boy who once sat silently by the window leaned forward and began to write. Life lesson. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Everyone carries hidden potential. The story of Elijah Brooks in The Boy by the Window teaches us a powerful truth. Silence doesn't mean apathy, and humility doesn't mean a lack of ability. In a world where the loudest voices often get the most attention, it's easy to overlook the quiet kids, the ones who sit in the back, keep their heads down, and rarely speak up. But sometimes, those are the very people who carry the most extraordinary gifts. Elijah wasn't trying to be seen. He wasn't chasing praise. He just genuinely loved math. It was his private world, calm, controlled, and beautiful in ways others couldn't see. But when the moment finally came and someone gave him a chance to step forward, he didn't just meet the challenge. He amazed everyone. All it took was one opportunity, one person who believed in him. From his story, we're reminded, everyone has potential, even those who don't raise their hands. A little belief can go a long way. A great teacher doesn't just teach, they see what others miss. So, don't rush to judge. Don't assume someone isn't capable just because they're quiet. And if you're the quiet one, know this. You don't have to be loud to be brilliant. You don't have to speak first to be remembered. You just need the right moment and the courage to take it. Because sometimes the quietest voices have the most powerful stories to tell.